The estranged son who was never invited to family gatherings until a DNA test changed everything. Let's take a trip into the heart of a family that seemed ordinary on the outside but hid deep secrets behind closed doors. At the center of this story is David, a man who always felt like an outsider in his own family. Growing up, David couldn't help but notice the subtle differences in how he was treated compared to his siblings. His parents, especially his father, always seemed distant, almost as if they were walking on eggshells around him. They never spoke about it openly, but David felt it in their eyes, their tone, the way they seemed just a bit more cautious with him. David's family was a large one. He had 2 brothers and a sister, all of whom shared a close bond. They laughed together, had inside jokes, and seemed to fit into the family like pieces of a puzzle. But David was always on the edge, watching them from the sidelines. He could never quite put his finger on it, but there was something that made him feel like he didn't belong. When David was a child, he tried to win his father's approval in every way he could. He worked hard in school, excelled in sports, and tried to be the best son he could be. But no matter what he did, he could never seem to break through that invisible wall that separated him from the rest of the family. His father was polite, even kind, but there was always a barrier, a sense of distance that made David feel like he was always just a visitor in his own home. As he grew older, David's feelings of isolation only deepened. Family gatherings were always the worst. While his siblings laughed and reminisced, David often found himself sitting alone, nursing a drink and pretending to be engrossed in something else. His parents seemed to forget he was even there most of the time. Birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries came and went, and David was always given a polite nod or a half-hearted invitation that felt more like an obligation than a genuine desire for him to be there. The final straw came one Christmas Eve. The whole family had gathered at his parents' house for their annual holiday celebration. The house was filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and the smell of freshly baked cookies. But when David arrived, it was as if he had walked into a room full of strangers. His mother gave him a quick hug, and his father barely looked up from his newspaper. His siblings, caught up in their conversations, offered only a few polite greetings. David could feel the distance in their eyes, the way they seemed to avoid his gaze. As the evening wore on, David found himself standing alone by the Christmas tree, watching his family interact, as if he wasn't even there. When it came time to open presents, his name was called last, and his gift was hastily handed to him with little fanfare. It was a sweater, several sizes too big, with a tag that still had the price on it. It was clear that it had been a last-minute purchase, something bought without any real thought or care. David stood there, holding the ill-fitting sweater, and realized that he had reached his limit. He couldn't take the feeling of being the odd one out any longer. He left that night without saying a word, driving away from his childhood home with a heavy heart and a sense that something had to change. In the months that followed, David began to distance himself even more from his family. He stopped attending the family gatherings and declined their calls. If they didn't want him there, he decided he wouldn't force himself to be part of their world. But deep down, a question gnawed at him. A question he had tried to ignore his entire life. Why did he always feel like he didn't belong? One day, as he was scrolling through social media, David came across a post about a popular DNA testing kit. It was supposed to reveal your ancestry and connect you with distant relatives. On a whim, and out of a sense of desperation, he decided to order one. Maybe, he thought, there was something in his bloodline that could explain the distance he had always felt from his family. Maybe it would help him understand why he had always been the outsider. A few weeks later, the kit arrived. David carefully followed the instructions, sending off a small sample of his DNA to the lab. He didn't expect much, but there was a part of him that hoped for some kind of answer. something that could explain the strange sense of disconnection that had haunted him all these years. The weeks that followed were filled with anticipation. Every time his phone buzzed, he hoped it was the notification he was waiting for. He was anxious, not quite sure what he was hoping to find, but knowing that he needed some kind of resolution. Finally, the results came in. David sat down at his computer, his heart pounding as he logged into the website. He clicked on the report, and his eyes widened as he read the words that would change everything he thought he knew about himself and his family. The results showed something David had never expected, something that sent a shockwave through his entire being. He had no genetic connection to the people he had called his family for his entire life. David was, in fact, a stranger to his own family. Suddenly, all the pieces began to fall into place. The distance, the awkwardness, the feeling of being different. It wasn't just in his head. It was real. David sat back in his chair, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Who was he? And why had his parents kept this secret from him all these years? David sat in stunned silence, staring at the DNA results that had turned his entire world upside down. The words on the screen seemed to blur together, and he read them over and over, hoping that somehow he had made a mistake. But the message was clear. There was no biological link between him and the people he had grown up calling his family. He felt a rush of emotions, anger, confusion, betrayal, and an overwhelming sadness. His mind spun with questions. If he wasn't their son, then whose son was he? Why had his parents never told him? And most importantly, what were they hiding? For days, David kept the revelation to himself. He didn't know how to approach his parents about something so shocking. But as the days turned into weeks, the need for answers began to consume him. He couldn't focus on anything else. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his father's indifferent face and his mother's forced smile. He needed to confront them. He needed to know the truth. One evening, David decided he could no longer wait. He picked up his phone and dialed his mother's number. His hand trembled slightly as he held the phone to his ear, listening to the familiar ring. His mother answered, her voice cheerful, almost as if she was relieved to hear from him after months of silence. "David, honey, it's been so long. How are you?" she asked, her voice warm and inviting. David took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "Mom, I need to talk to you and Dad. It's important." His mother hesitated for a moment. "Is everything okay, dear?" David paused, his heart pounding. "I think it would be better if we talked in person. Can I come over tomorrow?" There was another brief pause, and then she agreed, a slight hint of worry creeping into her tone. "Of course, David. We'll see you tomorrow." The next day, David drove to his parents' house with a heavy heart. The familiar streets felt strange to him now, like he was seeing them for the first time. When he arrived, his mother greeted him at the door with a nervous smile, and his father sat in his usual chair in the living room, looking up from his newspaper with a guarded expression. David sat down, his hands gripping the arms of the chair as if to steady himself. He didn't waste any time with small talk. "I need to know the truth," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I did a DNA test, and it says I'm not related to you." His mother's face paled and his father's eyes narrowed. For a moment, there was complete silence in the room. Then, his father cleared his throat, his voice gruff. "Who told you to do something like that?" David felt a flash of anger. "Does it matter? The results are clear. I have no genetic connection to either of you. What's going on?" His mother's eyes filled with tears, and she turned to his father as if seeking his permission to speak. David watched as a silent exchange passed between them, an exchange that only deepened his confusion and frustration. Finally, his father sighed heavily, setting his newspaper aside. "All right, you deserve to know," he said, his voice low and resigned. "We were going to tell you one day, but we never found the right time. David leaned forward, his heart racing. "Tell me what?" His mother took a deep breath, wiping a tear from her cheek. "David, we adopted you when you were a baby," she said, her voice trembling. "We tried to have children for many years, but we couldn't. Then one day we got a call from a distant relative who worked at a hospital. There was a newborn, abandoned at birth, and we were asked if we wanted to take you in." David felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. He had always known he was different, but he had never imagined this. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why keep this a secret?" His father spoke this time, his tone defensive. "We were afraid, David. Afraid that if you knew, you'd feel like you didn't belong, like you weren't part of this family. We thought we were doing the right thing by raising you as our own and never mentioning it." David shook his head, trying to make sense of it all. "But I always felt different. I always knew something wasn't right. Why didn't you ever explain?" His mother sobbed quietly, covering her face with her hands. His father looked away, his expression one of regret and pain. "We thought it was for the best," he muttered. "We never wanted you to feel unwanted." David sat back, feeling a mix of emotions he couldn't even name. He understood in a way their fear, their intentions, but it didn't make the hurt any less real. He felt like his whole life had been a lie. "Do you know anything about my real parents?" David finally asked, his voice soft, almost pleading. His mother wiped her eyes and nodded slowly. "All we know is what the hospital told us. You were left there by a young woman. She didn't leave any information about herself, and the hospital staff couldn't find her. They said she seemed scared and desperate. That's all we know, David. We never had any other details." David felt a surge of frustration. He had hoped for more, a name, a clue, something to hold on to. But it seemed like he was back to square one, with even more questions than before. He stood up slowly, feeling overwhelmed. "I need some time," he said quietly. I need to think." His mother reached out to him, her eyes filled with worry. "David, please, don't shut us out. We love you. You're our son, no matter what." David nodded, but he couldn't bring himself to say anything more. He turned and walked out of the house, the door closing behind him with a soft click. He got into his car and sat there for a moment, staring at the steering wheel, his mind racing. If his parents weren't his biological parents, then who was he? And where did he come from? He had no idea where to start, but he knew he couldn't rest until he found out the truth. He needed to find his real mother, the woman who had left him at the hospital all those years ago, and he needed to understand why. With a sense of determination growing inside him, David decided that his search was only just beginning. There had to be more to this story, and he was going to find it, no matter what it took. David's mind was swirling with questions as he drove away from his parents' house. He felt a deep sense of emptiness, like he was missing a piece of himself that he'd never even known existed. The truth was out, but it brought with it a whole new set of mysteries. Who was his real mother? Why had she left him at the hospital? And what other secrets lay buried in his past? He decided he needed to find answers, and he needed to start somewhere. Over the next few days, David began to search for any information he could find about his adoption. He contacted the hospital where he was left, hoping they might have some records or details that could point him in the right direction. But after several frustrating calls, he learned that the hospital had changed ownership several times, and most of the old records had been lost or destroyed. He felt like he was running into dead ends at every turn. Just as David was beginning to feel hopeless, a thought struck him. He remembered the DNA test that had set all of this in motion. The company had a feature that connected users with potential relatives based on shared genetic markers. Maybe, just maybe, there was someone out there who could help him. David logged back into the DNA testing website and went to the section labeled DNA Matches. His heart pounded as he scanned the list of names and percentages. Most were distant relatives, fourth or fifth cousins, but then he spotted one match that caught his eye. A woman named Angela, who was listed as a potential first cousin. Without hesitation, David sent a message through the website's messaging system. "Hi, Angela. My name is David. According to this DNA test, we are closely related. I've recently discovered that I was adopted and have no information about my biological family. If you're open to it, I would love to connect and see if you might have any information that could help me." He hit send and waited, feeling a mix of anxiety and hope. Hours passed, then days, and David began to fear that he wouldn't hear back. But just when he was about to give up, a notification popped up on his phone. It was a message from Angela. "Hi, David. I just saw your message. This is quite surprising for me as well. I don't know much, but my family has some secrets of its own. My mother might have some answers. She had a sister who disappeared years ago. Let's talk more." David felt a surge of excitement. He quickly responded, and soon he and Angela were exchanging messages back and forth. Angela explained that her mother, Patricia, had a sister named Emily who had vanished without a trace more than 30 years ago. The family had never spoken much about Emily, and Angela only knew bits and pieces from whispered conversations she'd overheard as a child. David and Angela agreed to meet in person, and a few days later they found themselves sitting across from each other in a small cafe. Angela was kind and warm, and David felt an instant connection with her. As they talked, Angela shared more details about her family, and David listened intently, hanging on to every word. "My mother rarely talks about Emily," Angela began. "But from what I know, Emily was young, barely out of high school, and she got into some kind of trouble. She ran away from home, and my grandparents never heard from her again. They always assumed she had started a new life somewhere, but—" She hesitated, glancing at David. "There were rumors she might have been pregnant when she left. I don't know if it's true, but it would explain a lot, wouldn't it?" David nodded, his heart racing. "It would explain everything," he whispered. "If Emily was my mother, it would make sense why I was left at the hospital and why no one ever knew where she went." Angela agreed to speak with her mother, Patricia, and try to find out more about Emily. David waited anxiously, hoping that Patricia might have the answers he needed. A few days later, Angela called him, her voice filled with excitement. "My mum agreed to meet with you," she said. "She thinks she might know something, but she wants to talk to you directly." David's heart leapt. This could be the break he had been waiting for. He arranged to meet Patricia at Angela's home, feeling a mix of excitement and fear. He knew he was on the verge of discovering the truth, but he was also afraid of what he might find. When he arrived, Patricia was already there. She was an older woman with a kind face, but there was a sadness in her eyes that spoke of years of buried pain. She greeted David with a tentative smile and gestured for him to sit down. "I hear you've been looking for answers," Patricia began, her voice soft but steady. David nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "I recently found out I was adopted," he explained, "and I think your sister Emily might be my mother." Patricia's eyes widened, and she took a deep breath, as if preparing herself to relive painful memories. "Emily was a free spirit," she began, "always getting into trouble, but she had a good heart. When she disappeared, our family was devastated. We searched for her for years, but never found a trace. But there were hints that she might have had a child. If that child is you, then maybe, finally, we have some closure." Patricia reached into her bag and pulled out an old photograph, handing it to David. It was a picture of a young woman with bright eyes and a shy smile. "This is Emily," Patricia said softly. "Do you see any resemblance?" David stared at the photo, his heart pounding. He saw something familiar in her eyes, a flicker of recognition deep within him. "I think so," he murmured, tears welling up in his eyes. Patricia continued, "There's one more thing. A few years after Emily disappeared, I received a letter. It was unsigned, but I always believed it was from her. She mentioned she had made a mistake and that she hoped her child would find a better life. I kept it all these years, hoping one day it would mean something." David felt a surge of emotion as Patricia handed him the worn envelope. He opened it with trembling hands, pulling out the faded letter. As he read the words, tears streamed down his face. "To whoever finds this," the letter began, "I made some choices that I'm not proud of. I left my child at a hospital because I knew I couldn't give him the life he deserved. I hope he finds a family that loves him the way I always wanted to, but couldn't. Please forgive me." David's heart ached as he read his birth mother's words. He could feel her pain, her regret, but also her love. She had given him up, not because she didn't care, but because she had wanted what was best for him. He finally understood the sacrifice she had made and the burden she had carried all those years. David looked up at Patricia, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for helping me find this piece of my past." Patricia smiled, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm just glad we could finally connect the dots," she replied, "and that you finally know where you come from." As David left Angela's home that day, he felt lighter than he had in years. He didn't have all the answers, but he had a piece of the puzzle, a connection to a family he never knew he had. He still had a lot to process, and a lot of healing to do, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was starting to understand who he truly was. In the months that followed, David began to build a relationship with Angela and Patricia. He found comfort in knowing that he wasn't alone, that he had roots and a story that connected him to something larger. And though his past was filled with mystery and pain, he finally felt like he had a future to look forward to. David would never forget the family that raised him, the people who had given him a home and tried their best to love him in their own way. But now, he had the chance to embrace his whole story, the one that had been hidden from him for so long. He realized that family isn't just about blood, it's about connections, choices, and the love that binds us no matter how complicated or messy it may be. And with that realization, David found peace, a peace he had been searching for his entire life.